If you think Caribbean history is just pirates and postcards, you're missing the moment when two distant islands were thrown into the same colonial furnace and came out changed forever. Stay with us. This story rewires what you think you know about how nations are made. Jamaica is a land of staggering beauty, where the blue mountains rise through mist like a painted horizon, and the island's music sets a global pulse. But beneath the color and rhythm lies a foundation poured in sugar, violence, forced labor, and human endurance. To understand how this nation was truly forged, we have to return to a collision year, 1655. History is often taught as tidy dates and tidy empires, but real history is built from broken people who survived impossible systems. By the 17th century, Spanish rule had already devastated the indigenous Taino population and introduced enslaved Africans to the island. Then Britain seized Jamaica and arrived with an extraction plan measured not in crops, but in bodies. They didn't just bring ships. They brought a labor engine powered by Irish prisoners, Scottish captives, and English convicts, alongside the rapidly expanding system of African slavery. What followed was not a side note. It was a turning point. A brutal economic transition unfolded, from fixed-term indentured servitude to permanent hereditary chattel slavery, because in plantation logic, lifetime ownership meant higher profit and tighter control. Policy hardened, laws followed money. Humanity was itemized. Today, traces of Irish ancestry, names, and cultural echoes remain woven into Jamaican society, not as a curiosity, but as evidence of an early and overlooked population layer inside the Atlantic slave economy. In this investigation, we break open the furnace, how the plantation labor model transformed, how Irish and African histories intersected on Caribbean soil, how shared oppression helped shape a culture of resistance that outlived empire. This is not a travel postcard. This is the origin story behind the postcard. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The British didn't just inherit Jamaica, they re-engineered it. Where Spanish rule had been limited and uneven, the new colonial managers were methodical. To imperial planners, the void left by the devastated Taino population was not recorded as tragedy, but measured as capacity. Jamaica was reshaped into a working model of the plantation empire, and some of its earliest labor was pulled from a wounded Ireland. In the aftermath of the Cromwellian Wars, displacement and forced transport followed. Prisoners, rebels, and the destitute were sentenced to Atlantic servitude and shipped to the Caribbean. On paper, they were indentured servants, bound by contracts measured in years. In practice, protections often dissolved on arrival. Terms were extended, conditions were brutal, and survival was uncertain. In those early plantation years, Irish servants and enslaved Africans sometimes worked the same fields, under the same overseers, exposed to the same disease and exhaustion, but under different legal systems, with very different futures. This was the proving ground, where plantation owners refined just how far human labor could be pushed in the pursuit of sugar, the commodity they called white gold. By the late 1600s, the experiment was delivering its conclusion. Sugar was no longer a luxury. It was a global obsession. Demand surged, profits soared. But the plantation system had a structural problem. Indentured contracts ended. Surviving servants could, in time, claim freedom. For plantation investors, temporary labor meant unstable returns. The response was a calculated legal pivot. Colonial lawmakers began rewriting the rules of labor itself. While European indenture remained time-bound, African bondage was increasingly codified as permanent chattel slavery, a status defined as property, not contract. One doctrine made the shift irreversible: partus sequitur ventrem, the legal principle that a child inherited the status of the mother. Enslavement became hereditary. The labor force could now reproduce itself inside the system, but demographics created fear. Enslaved Africans and poor European laborers together vastly outnumbered the planter elite. The threat was not just economic, it was political. A shared uprising was the nightmare scenario, so a divide was deliberately reinforced through law, privilege, and punishment. Limited advantages were extended to poor Europeans, while Africans were stripped of legal personhood. Over time, racial hierarchy hardened into policy and practice. The separation wasn't just social, it was strategic, because divided labor is controllable labor, and the sugar economy was built to keep control first and conscience last. When the furnace of the 17th century cooled, it left behind a cultural alloy unlike anything else in the Atlantic world. This was not simple coexistence. It was collision, adaptation, and reinvention. The island that emerged was neither European nor African, but something forged between pressure and survival. You can even hear traces of that fusion in how Jamaica speaks. Linguists note that Jamaican patois draws primarily from West African language structures layered onto English vocabulary. But some researchers also point to rhythmic and melodic speech patterns that echo Irish and Scottish dialect influence, carried by early servants and settlers. Not the main ingredient, but part of the seasoning. The connection ran deeper than language. It lived in behavior and resistance. Both displaced Irish servants and enslaved Africans occupied the lowest rungs of the colonial order. On some plantations and frontier zones, they worked in proximity, traded knowledge, shared foodways, and, despite harsh anti-mixing laws, formed relationships. Records and parish archives show cases of intermarriage and mixed families, especially as indentured terms ended and social boundaries blurred at the margins. There were also moments of direct alliance. In Jamaica's mountainous interior, communities of escaped enslaved Africans formed independent strongholds, later known as Maroon societies. While these groups were predominantly African in origin and leadership, historical accounts note that a small number of European deserters and runaway servants, including Irish, were absorbed into Maroon settlements. They contributed skills in language, firearms, and terrain tactics. These were not symbolic partnerships. They were survival pacts. Some Maroon communities developed structured local governance, treaties, land boundaries, military command, and diplomatic negotiation with the colonial authorities. They functioned as semi-independent polities inside hostile territory. Connection did not erase difference, but it created cooperation where empire expected division. The map of Jamaica still carries quiet markers of this layered past. Districts and settlements such as Irish Town, Sligoville, and Clonmel preserve the naming fingerprints of Irish presence. These are not myths. They are cartographic memory. The legacy also lives in surnames threaded through modern Jamaica, names like Collins, Murphy, Kelly, Burke, and O'Hara, carried today by many Afro-Jamaican families. Not as proof of a single origin story, but as evidence of centuries of contact, mixture, and continuity. Two islands entered the story through force. What endured was forged by people. Centuries after the first forced crossings, the echoes of that collision still shape the nation that stands today. Jamaica's motto, "Out of many, one people," is more than ceremony, it's a historical outcome. It must also include those who were here first. The Taino were not erased in a single moment. They were absorbed, scattered, and nearly destroyed. Today, their descendants live mostly through blended ancestry and cultural traces rather than as a separate nation within Jamaica. Modern Jamaica is predominantly Afro-Jamaican in ancestry, with additional European, including Irish, threads woven through language, names, and memory, not equal in weight, but real in presence. This legacy doesn't live only in archives, it lives in motion and sound, in the explosive drive of its athletes, the rhythms that reshaped global music, and a national spirit that bends without breaking. What began as a plantation experiment became something empire never planned, a cultural force the world could not ignore. The furnace made the pressure, the people made the power. This is the danger of the travel postcard. It shows you the beauty, but hides the blueprint. Once you understand the forces behind what you see, you stop being a tourist of history and start reading the systems that built it. Because the machinery that once priced human lives didn't disappear with the plantations. It adapted. It went underground. It learned to hide in plain sight. In our next investigation on crimes of a nation, we travel thousands of miles east to the Nepal-India border, where organized networks still move human beings through deception, debt, and silence. No ships, no chains, just vanished names and rewritten futures. We'll follow the watchers at the crossing points, the ones who read the signs, interrupt the routes, and pull victims back before the line is crossed for good. Different century, same market logic. Look past the postcard, study the furnace. This is Crimes of a Nation, where we investigate the system, not just the story. Stay curious, stay cautious, and keep your eyes on the system, not just the scenery.